Well, good afternoon. We would like to welcome you to History for Lunch. It's our second one for the month of April, and we are delighted to have everyone here. We're just going to ask that if you are joining us virtually, if you will please mute your computers, that will help us out quite a bit. And we just want to give a reminder before we start today that on April the 29th, we'll have Mr. Will Dunstan here, who is an Elizabeth City native, and he will be talking about Neil Cropsey and Jim Wilcox, the murder. And that's going to be Saturday, April the 29th at 11 a.m. And then on May the 3rd, we're going to have Mr. Michael Marshall, who is author and researcher of Southern decorative arts and local history, who will discuss the works of artist Leopold Paul Unger. We have recently acquired a portrait of Gaston Poole that is currently being conserved and is believed to have been one of Unger's works. And he is very known, wide known for painting in several states. And we also think there's other portraits too that he painted, including Lee and the Skinner families of Clemens County. So he will be our guest speaker on May the 3rd at 12 noon. Today, we would like to welcome Ms. Colleen Karl with the Edenton-Chowan Environmental Group to discuss the purple air sensors that capture any increase in air particles that may be released. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, welcome and happy Earth Week to everyone. And I think there's plenty of environmentalists sitting in the audience here and probably on the Zoom call as well. And so hopefully some of the things that we'll talk about today will be of interest to you and maybe something that your organization can kind of zone in on and maybe be a part of at some point. I wanted to just briefly introduce myself, and I will go through some of these slides as an overview. Some of them are just a little history of what we've been doing in the past. Not a lot there. I spent a lot of time looking at what we have gleaned from the purple air research and the air quality research that actually preceded that, and why that prompted us to write the proposal for those purple air sensors. It's been a work in progress. And, you know, with science, you never know how stuff is going to happen. And just as expected, you know, we were all set last year to capture lots of great air quality with lots of algal blooms, and we had none. And so, you know, so we've got a tremendous amount of what I would call background data, or certainly data that will help us as baseline. But as of this point, we really don't have a lot of action through the blooms. Now, you know, just between you and us, and I'll say that I'm hoping for at least a little bloom this summer. You don't want to say that too loud because there's lots of folks that don't want that to happen at all. But it would help us to understand and qualify what is actually happening with these sensors a little bit more, because we've placed them strategically. And I'll talk more about that as we go through this. But my name is Colleen Karl, and I have a little bit of background here in science, a degree in oceanography some many odd years ago, and most of my life in outreach education, science education specifically. So, you know, as I started to work with the CEG in around 2010, 2012, you know, I was able to use some of the skills that have been part of my career along the way in both ways, education and in science. And so that's been an asset. So we work directly with many researchers at this point. We get calls a lot from folks that are exploring what might be happening in the Albemarle Pamlico Sound area. And, you know, they look for community resources that can help them, especially when they're setting up research projects. That's one of the hardest things for them to do oftentimes. They've got all the science and all the mechanisms behind them, but finding that right location or the right partners is sometimes difficult. So we're glad to be that association for them and to work with them hand in hand on some of these projects. I will say that just as a quick disclaimer, while I do have a science background, I am not the researchers on this. And so I have included some resources for you, those of you that might have journal access. Some of these are open source, but as you guys know, some journals are still very locked down, and you have to, you know, go through an institution or whatever to get some of those papers to read them. But I've got a couple of links up here that if you're interested, you might want to read these papers, especially in light of the research that's going on with aerosols, especially in terms of particle research. So there's a lot of it happening right now. Okay, so let's move on here real quickly. And let's see if I can figure out how to advance that. The mission of the CEG really hasn't changed since 2007, the inception of that. We do a tremendous amount of community programs. COVID like everybody, slowed us down for a couple of years, but we're back now and into the full swing of things, getting programs scheduled for the year and, trying to reach out to the community in ways. We tend to look at problems in the community that are relevant and focus our work and our research connections on those things. And that's been pretty successful, especially since 2015, when things happened in our area. In 2012 to 2015, we were engaged in a mapping a hydrilla project, which hydrilla is an invasive aquatic. And it was all over the Chowan. I mean, it was just all like thick as kelp beds. And I'm not kidding about that, so the county was perplexed as to where to spray, how much to spray. And so we worked with Sea Grant to sort of put together a GPS so that it was mapped, coordinate mapped locations of all the hydrilla that was out there, and there was a lot of it. And so, limited budget, you had to sort of decide where you're going to spray, if you're going to spray. And those communities that wanted spraying to happen, they were very loud in their voices, like spray here, and there were other places that were higher priority for the county. So that was a really tough little project. But for 3 years, we actually had a really good idea where the hydrilla was popping back up, and that is a really interesting little tuber. It hangs around for, I think, about 10 years in the sediments. Well, in 2015, things changed dramatically. As a matter of fact, after 2015, we went back looking for those tubers in the places where the hydrilla was so thick and couldn't find it. So I don't know if it will be back or if at any time we're going to see much hydrilla, but there's not much of it in our system at all. Matter of fact, I haven't seen any. In 2015, we had our first big algal bloom. And these are pictures from 2015 that were right in the town of Edenton. If you go there at all, you'll recognize some of these places as the bridge going over to Hayes Plantation and right downtown on the waterfront there. And these were seriously cyanobacteria. We drove by it and I rolled the window down and I said to my husband, I can't even breathe. And so I got my camera out and I took pictures and I said, oh, I got to call somebody about this because I knew what it was. And, I had seen it in the Chowan River, although it had been in the river some 35, 40 years ago, and it kind of got cleaned up. It was back in 2015. And so we really didn't know what to expect. So we had a lot of attention that year, but, everybody figured it'll go away just like everything else. Well, it really didn't go away. So as there's a lot of research right now that's capturing what we've learned, at least in the last few years, is what kind of bacteria, cyanobacteria we have. Those are the blue-green algae. How prevalent they are, what are the triggers maybe that will cause these blooms to some extent, although sometimes they remain mysterious. And another thing that I know a lot of you are interested in is the toxins that are given off by these, because we've had recorded toxins that are well over World Health Organization limits, well over, and that is of concern. So for the last 7, 8 years, we have religiously sent photomicrographs down to NOAA in South Carolina. We're part of this phytoplankton monitoring network. So that means once a week in the summertime and much less often in the wintertime, usually once a month, we meet and we look at water samples and we take pictures of what's in them. And so you can clearly see that there's 5 or 4 sample points that are up the river there, town of Edenton, and then a couple other locations that are there. Those samples get sent digitally to NOAA. They take a look at them. And if the sample is the color of this water that's in that picture right there, we actually send a physical sample to them as well. So they are the clearinghouse for freshwater and marine algal blooms all over the place. They do a lot better job with the marine stuff right now, and that's red tide and all that kind of stuff. But we're one of the freshwater sites here in North Carolina, and I think it's very important that we continue to send this information to them because it's a catalog of what's happening and when it's happening. Well, we realized after a couple of years of working with PMN that we needed to tackle a few more things because there was much that we didn't know about these algal blooms, much. And the researchers were saying the same thing. The freshwater blooms, you can read the news all over the world. They're showing up in various different places. And, people are scratching their heads. Why? What's causing this? Is it the, global warming, or is it more nutrients, or what is the cause of this? And there are obviously multiple causes of that. But, we figured that maybe we better sort of listen to what the researchers were asking and, maybe play a little bit more closely, collaboratively with them and encourage that kind of work so that we could get some more answers. And so we've done a number of projects over the last few years because, this is not the Chowan River and the Pasquotank River and the Perquimans River are not just isolated rivers. They're part of a big system, the Albemarle Sound and the Pamlico Sound. And, there's worry about those bodies of water because of these blooms that are happening up our rivers. So we got busy. So we got involved with some, and these are just some of the listing of some of the research projects that we have been involved in. Where, and I know that the Green Saves Green group here in Elizabeth City is involved in some of these as well. We've done specific nutrient analyses to determine what kind of nitrates or phosphates might be triggering these blooms. And that stuff is done with pretty good chemical analyses out of UNC or someplace that's got an analytical lab. So we can tell it's not just a little test kit. Okay, so, we're doing some pretty high quality research work here with the researchers, and there's some protocols for taking samples as well. And then we did a bioassay. We had our first CCRG, which is a community collaborative research grant. And that was through IMS down at Moorhead. And we did an assay in Edenton Bay to take a look at if it was really the nitrogen or the phosphorus. And believe it or not, what that showed was different times of the year, different things. You sort of expect that, but there are different needs of these algae or these bacteria at different times of the year. So that told us a little bit, but it didn't tell us enough. So we continued to do some more work with Albemarle RC&D, and that one we're working on concurrently now. Our job, the Chowan Environmental job, is to actually sample Potocacy Creek, which is a very big east-west tributary that dumps a lot of nutrients into the Chowan River high up. It's closer to Hertford area if you're looking on the map, but it's a very big creek. And there's a lot of issues with that creek. A lot of things that we've known about for a long time is high nutrients up there. And so we're trying to figure out not only what's happening with those nutrients, but some more specifics about maybe what the sources of those nutrients are. And if I have time today, I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And so the latest project, especially with COVID, we weren't able to work in any labs. And so the researchers were scratching their heads, said, well, are you guys okay with working outside? I said, yeah, it's not a hurricane, we're fine. And so, we got together with the researchers and we were able to set up some really good aerosol projects in a couple locations on the Chowan River and in the town of Edenton, right on Pembroke Bay there, or Pembroke Creek, to look at how much aerosols might be coming off of these algal blooms if we had them. And that research was very highly tuned. We brought in some big heavy equipment, some very nice equipment to work with, not just little things that you might hold up in your hand, but this was pretty good stuff that we were using. And so that was under the thumb of Dr. Hans Perl and his graduate student, soon to be Dr. Haley Ploss. And those folks were wonderful. I mean, they were up here all the time. I mean, we helped them with, filtering, we helped them with all sorts of stuff that would happen in the field. We weren't able to do any lab work at all. And we all had to mask outside because of COVID. But we made it through 2 years of research with that. And boy, I'll tell you, we learned a lot from that. And actually, that was the spurring point for this Purple Air grant that happened. As that's what we're going to talk mostly about today. All right. So here's this article up here is actually open source, and you might want to link on this if this goes out as a PowerPoint, or this can be sent out. The museum can send this to you as well. This is a to read. I would wade through this. It's very technical, but it's really interesting and very informative. I just summarized. It's a critical review, and it really was the first step the researchers took to look at what everybody else knows out there. That's what you do when you do research. You find out what other people know, and so then you springboard off of that. So what they found out from doing the research survey and writing this critical review is that there's a couple things important here, that the HAB cells, or the harmful algal blooms, and I'm going to use these acronyms, and I want to make sure that you all know CHABs is the same thing. It's just cyanohabs. Okay, you might see actually cyanohabs up there. HAB is the short term for harmful algal blooms. And so that's used extensively throughout any PowerPoint or anything you're going to read. I mean, they use these acronyms a lot. So the HAB cells and what's in them, and sometimes it's all sorts of chemicals that are in there as well, toxins included, are capable of getting into incorporating themselves into the surface aerosols above a watershed. Okay, the researchers know that already. Some researchers, some were unable to prove that. The processes that govern this, and this is a real eye-opener for me to read this, because it's a course of physics. Okay, I mean, literally, if you read how these aerosols actually form and how they form, it's not a simple thing. I mean, what governs it, what controls it, it's controlled by all sorts of external variables, relative humidity being one of them, wind, of course, because you've got a lot of wind shear in this area, UV radiation, how much salinity is in there, all sorts of players are playing a role in this as to whether or not those things are even going to aerosolize. And then the dynamics of the physics as to whether or not the bubble or the aerosol bubble will get to the surface, and then it can be popped up, and those little tiny little particles, really microscopic particles, go into the spray that's going to be above the watershed, and then how far they will travel. And so there's a lot that remains unknown about this. As a matter of fact, we know less than we know about these aerosols and what we need to know further. So without question, this is not a closed story. There will be lots more research coming down in this direction, and probably a lot of it here in North Carolina. We also know that the toxins that are in these algae, when they produce toxins, and that's another big question because we don't even know that. Sometimes they produce them and sometimes they don't. And when that happens is still a mystery. I mean, we just can't go out there and say, oh, they got toxins, because sometimes they don't. But we do know that when the toxins are released, that they can make their way into the particles that are above the watershed as well. Okay, so they've actually sampled and found evidence of toxins, primarily microcystins, which belongs to a class of toxins that are their liver. They work with your in bad respect for your liver, but there are some neurological toxins that come off of this as well. So in the summer of 2021, we set up 2 summers in a row. We set up these huge aerosol collectors. And that's Haley right there. And Steve is up there too, manipulating. And, she did some plates up there. That's a picture of her. Not only did we sample with the aerosol collectors, but she was actually sampling dry samples or wet samples with plates that were put out, because you back up your research in a couple of ways. So there were a lot of controls on this as well. So 2 locations up in the county, right on the Chowan River, and then the other one, the lower picture down there, is at on Pembroke Creek. And these aerosols ran for a long period of time, all summer long. Basically, they were on for 12 hours. And then every couple of weeks, the researchers were up here with us in between, helping facilitate that, to take out those samples they were plated basically, and take them back in very sterile conditions to analyze. Okay, so they were looking for 2 things. They were looking for how much mass is coming off of those blooms, how much is actually in the air that's just algal cells. And the second thing is, are there any toxins in there too? Okay, now these particles are the kind that we talk about when we talk about things that can damage your lungs and stuff like that. 2.5 micrometers. These are very tiny little particles. If you watch the smoke and stuff in this area, you can see those on air collectors and stuff. Those are the things that you don't want to be breathing in for any length of time. They are dangerous to your health. People that have asthma and other related respiratory diseases, would want to stay inside on these days. Okay, so what we don't know really clearly about these algal blooms is how much of an effect they might be having on areas that are close to the water or even farther away, because they travel far. They travel quite far, as a matter of fact. So I'm going to still say that we've very little known at this point about the toxins. We have lots of questions. All right, so the study focuses, I sort of reiterated there before, but just so that you know what it was, we were looking for microcystins, those are the toxins in these communities above the airshed. And we were looking for what kind of environmental conditions would cause this to happen. Was it the wind fetch? Was it the big winds? Was it relative humidity? In the summertime, we got the dog days all summer long, so we have high humidity. Was it that? Was it changes in salinity? So we were taking not only air samples, but also obviously we were using big equipment out there to sample the water as well. We wanted to identify if there were any associations between those concentrations, the bloom events, and the concentration in the airshed. Okay, here's the results. And I'm going through this a little bit fast too, because there's lots more in this. I mean, this is a published paper at this point, and the references I can give you that. It is not open source. So we could probably make some of that available to you, but this is a summary of that. We didn't actually find any toxins. Okay, so no microcystins. And now there was one substantial bloom, I mean, a really good one in July of that year. In 2020, that was, all the researchers, oh yeah, it's blooming. Okay, they got all excited. But, surprisingly enough, no toxins in those samples at all, or at least they were not detected. And they're using pretty sophisticated technology and, equipment to detect toxins. These are sent out for, mass spectrometer analysis and stuff like that. So we did know, or we knew, that there were several of those genera in the Chowan River that do produce toxins. They were there. Okay. So why they didn't produce them, that's still a mystery, but they did not. And they're listed there, delicious sperma microsystem, and the last one that everybody calls algae because nobody can say that word. But those are the three that we see in the Chowan River pretty much all the time. They were associated concurrently. In other words, they were all in the spray. Okay, they were all showing up there, pieces of them, and that was done with DNA analysis, by the way, so that we could tell what the genre were. Okay, because it's pretty tough to tell in the water. You can see them, but if they're aerosolized, those are tiny little particles there. So we did some plates of special filtering for DNA analysis so we could know what these were specifically. And then, of course, we did find out that there was definitely elevated mass concentrations of some of these particles when we had the algal blooms. Okay, so a little summary here, and this was a summary point in this paper, this research paper in the HAB event that was the delicious spermum event. It was pretty much July, really late June and early July, lasted for a couple of weeks, and it was all up and down the Chowan River and some in the Pembroke Creek as well. The concentrations increased, and you can see that significantly above the non-bloom events. So substantially, they saw an increase in the particulate matter that was there in the air shed as well. So after 2 years of this research, Haley and I got scratching our heads. We said we really need to do a better job with outreach of this because, we don't have anything. And before I start to talk about that, you already know that this is a big health problem. Okay. And there's much that we don't know about this. So I'll leave that up there. We have difficulty forecasting when these things are going to produce toxins. And we certainly don't know enough about what's in the air shed at all and what we're all breathing in. Okay. Or what the animals are ingesting or what we're swimming in for that matter. Lots more research has to be done. But in 2021, after we finished with a lot of this aerosol research, Haley and I were talking and with Hans too, and we said, we need to do a better job of outreach. How do we get this message out to the people, and how do we get people involved in at least being cognizant of the fact that there's an algal bloom in their backyard or on their river, or if they're going out with a jet ski that they may want to notice that. And so Haley said to me, do you know about purple air sensors? And I said, I have no clue. I never heard of them. She said, Google it. I said, all right. That's what you do these days. I Googled it. And oh man, California, they're loaded out there. They got a ton of these things because obviously this company started up as response to some of the wildfires that were out on the West Coast. And they've done very well. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of these around. They're relatively inexpensive. They mount simply. I can say the only problem that we've run into with them is maybe network protocols, which is something that's sort of out of our control. But they're this size, and I'm holding this up in my hand here so that you guys can't see it, but they're not big. And they're very affordable. They come with a very long cord. I have one at my house right now installed, and basically it's plugged into an upstairs bedroom window, and it's on my roof line, snaked into the upstairs. But we've installed them just running the cord directly down to an outside outlet and putting it on your roof line. They're best someplace where there's free airflow, and excuse me for a minute. And then they set about just monitoring airflow constantly, and it shows up live. Excuse me for a second. This is real time. So this shows up live on a map, and you can Google purpleair.com and go to map and take a look at the sensors right now that are recording particulate matter, 2.5 particles, size particles, micrometers in this area constantly at this point. Now, we got a real thrill a couple of weeks ago when we had smoke coming up from the wildfires down in county. Everybody was in the red zone. They're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? You could go outside and you knew that. I mean, the air was just thick with fog. It reached all the way up to Elizabeth City. Everybody was in the danger zone because of those wildfires. But we now know that those are recording, and they're doing a really good job of that. The big question is how can we tell if this is an algal bloom or if it's a smoke from somebody's barbecue? Okay. And that is a question, and that remains a question. So last year we didn't have any algal blooms. We spent a lot of time collecting some background data that may give us some insight as to what normal background barbecue, a little smoke in the area, a little fog in the area might be. And that's important to have. We've also got a calibrated device that was installed up at Arrowhead Beach, one of our sites, that will help in refine whether or not these sensors are measuring as close as accurate as possible. It's always important to calibrate your equipment. And while these are calibrated, there's no guarantee that they're measuring what EPA standards might like to have. So we took the trouble of installing some finer equipment at one location so we could compare those results to what the purple air sensors were measuring. The trick this summer, and if we have an algal bloom, will be to use, a lot of our spotters that have these installed, and we're working with Albemarle Regional Health and the museum and other partners as well, to let us know that if the sensors go crazy with readings, that well, maybe it's because there's some, smoke coming in from someplace, or maybe it's because we've got a bloom on our back door. We need to know that ancillary data in order to be able to sort of tie these together. And we will be doing a lot of that, via either not probably chat rooms or Facebook or something like that. So we can stay up with what's actually happening in your neighborhood. Because this is hard research to do, as you said, as you all know. Any kind of environmental parameter is going to skew this data. So one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we've got a good handle on what that is as best as possible. Here's a picture that it's a screenshot basically, and that one that you see the 62 there, that's sort of in the moderate range. This was in, I'm trying to think, this was in January, I think, that I screenshotted this, but it was actually the harbor master's office in Edenton where there's one of these installed. And I don't know why it was so high that day, because the ones around the area were not as high. Generally, you can see them all going in, red if they all go red at the same time. So you've got that, but you can kind of follow purpleair.com and see these. As I said, this is real time. There's a setting up on there that if you Google it, you can take a look at it. There's a 10-minute interval. If you're not seeing any changes, because you need to change how the device is being pushed to their network and how it's being displayed. So I have mine set at real time, so it changes kind of automatically. Occasionally I see these go dark on the map and I'll say, oh, what's going on? Matter of fact, I was up here a couple of weeks ago trying to figure out why the one at the museum went dark. It just a little gray spot up there. And so sometimes that is because the network signal is not strong enough to send it to the device. This is like a peripheral, like a printer or something like that. And I don't know about you all, but when my internet gets a little weird, sometimes just running the printer is a challenge. So same with these. So if you have, generally it comes back online without any problem at all. But we've had a few that we've had to kind of mess around with. Secret funded a lot of Haley's research. There's the researchers always get, grant money from a number of different sources. And, they were particularly interested in this because they've been following for a number of years what was going on in Eastern North Carolina with the algal blooms. And so when this aerosol researcher, and by the way, she's with the School of Public Health, proposed this to them, they said, sure, we'll help you with whatever you need. So they gave her, a fair amount of money, and they also followed up with a really nice article. So this is a really good one to read because it tells a little bit about, it's kind of like a story. It tells about some of the people that we've, engaged in our community to put these sensors on their houses. And, we're looking to get a diverse array of folks. We have some nonprofits. We have some, places like this, museums. The museums and schools are a little hard because of the network protocols to get into. We have some homeowners. We have a variety of different folks that have been expressed interest in this, and we want to continue to grow that. We had funding initially for 20 sensors, and we've been able to extend that a little bit more because we kind of reworked the budget a little bit. You know how that goes with grants. So we were able to get a few more that will be coming in, and we'll be placing those all around Eastern North Carolina, all the way from Northampton County, by the way, all the way over to this area, to Camden County. And actually one will go out of Dare County as well. So, so they're strategically placed for a couple of reasons. Let me go back to this map for a second here. On some of these locations, so you have to zoom in to see it, there's actually transects. So some of these were set up deliberately, like in a linear type of fashion, or at least distance-wise, to look at a place that might have particles coming right off the water. So a homeowner volunteered to have one of these that lives right on the water. And then we put one a mile back, within a mile. And then we put another one greater than a mile. And that didn't have to be anything specific because, as I said, these particles are tiny and they go far. We don't know how far. So if, like, for Arrowhead Beach, as an example, might have a bloom this summer, we have a lot of them up there. And that's that location about halfway up the Chowan River there. There's 3 sensors up there. So, we're going to look, if we have a bloom, what might be happening right there at the water, and then following that, in a transect line, a mile out and then farther than a mile out, to see if there's any correlation between the particle movement and the blooms. Okay. Okay, let me see what kind of time we got here. Oh, got lots of time. I talk fast. It's all right, lots of times for question. So I will mention a couple of other things, and I know that you guys have a lot of questions. Matter of fact, maybe we should stop right here before I finish up and ask if there's some audience questions about purple air, because I think that there probably might be. And this is, I was just going to kind of finish with this other piece of research that we're doing, but I want to make sure that I listen to what your questions are and answer those the best way I can. And maybe we could kind of figure out, a plan for this area. I would love to see more resources allocated, maybe more grants. I know I've been talking to the Biden folks down at Edenton about, putting a sensor network in, because one of the things about the sensors is that, while the grant was written for this relationship between harmful algal blooms and HABs, by the way, which are harmful algal particles. So it's very cool. You could say HABs and HAPs in the same breath, but so they're always using these acronyms. But when we wrote this grant, we were thinking, well, this is good for, talking about algal blooms, but we also realized that this is just generally good for the public to look at, and, if they have any kind of respiratory concerns. I know I have allergies terribly. So when there are days that there are compromised air out there, bothers me. And so there are folks that have maybe more problems than I do. And so if they're looking at these air sensors, this big map up here, which is kind of cool, and it is in real time, I'll go back to that, they happen to see it in the red zone, a dangerous zone, they might be advised to stay in that day. So a side benefit from that is just plain old general air quality. And we don't really have any sensors in this area at all. And so, having these little sensors here to sort of help monitor overall health of the air is not a bad idea at all. So this is an added benefit. And, there's across the state, across the northeast part of the state, there's concern about a lot of air pollution coming from various different sources. And I think that might be something that we pay attention to a little bit more in the future. I know the EPA is definitely paying attention to that. So before I finish up with some of the other research and stuff that we might be doing, I want to just ask if there are any questions about the Purple Air Project and things that I might be able to answer for you. Are there some audience questions? Okay, we're going to use a remote mic here. That might be the easiest thing.
Hi, Dr. Peter Finn.
Hey.
The question I have is, are any of your researchers doing research in microclimatology, specifically as it concerns the water-air interface?
Well, that's an interesting question. In terms of microclimatology, I think we're seeing a lot of changes in this area. As my background is, and I was always fascinated by the air-water interface when I was learning oceanography many years ago. That's a very interesting place for stuff to happen, okay? And I don't think that we've got anybody that's zoned in specifically on the changes in the climate related to that air-water interface, but I think it's a possibility down the road, because as I mentioned, there's so many factors, pH, things like that, that are included, that as these particles form aerosols, all those are parameters that are influencing those aerosolizations, that aerosolization process. So no one that I know of, but I think this is a relatively open field. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, Haley is not a blue-green algae researcher. She's not a cyanobacteria researcher, but she got to learn a lot about a cyanobacteria real fast. But she's a public health person, okay? And, her area of expertise is that. And so, working with UNCIMS, there's a fair number of folks down there that are highly interested in what's causing these blooms in this area. Not as much so as in the air-water interface, but I think that as papers start to get published and more research gets out there, there will be those folks that have expertise in that area coming out of the woodwork and saying, let us help you understand the physics and the dynamics of that very complex process as particles aerosolize. Did I answer that question okay for you?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I know of no one right now that's doing that, but I think that's a really open book. I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of open books on this story, and we could be working for the next 20 years and still, and I say that because 25 years ago, I was actually working with the folks that were working on some of the marine toxins that were coming off things like red tide down in the Moorhead area. I did a number of educational programs related to that, and I learned a lot. I mean, that was part of that process, was you had to sort of learn the sciences, especially if you wanted to relate it to outreach. But that was at the very beginning of our knowledge of some of these toxins that come off of these marine, plankton blooms. We know nothing about these freshwater ones. I mean, we're really at the beginning of that process right now. So it's taken 25 years to get there with the marine ones. Okay, we know quite a bit about red tide now, about when it blooms, when it doesn't, when to stay out of the way of that, and all sorts of stuff. But there's still a lot of those blooms that are still very marine ones that are still a lot of things unknown about them as well. But we've got a better body of knowledge with the marine ones, but not so much for the freshwater cyanobacteria that we see in the Chowan River, we see in the Perquimans River. And by the way, the Chowan wasn't the first. I mean, maybe we were the first to be noticed, but there's been blooms in the Chowan, in the Perquimans and also in the Pasquotank, a lot more in the past few years. And keep in mind that these are all connected to the Albemarle Sound. I think that's the big key word there. Okay. Yes, sir.
Comment on any possible, would you comment on any possible correlation between HAD neurotoxins and ALS?
I can't comment on that. What I can tell you is what I've read. And I'm not a researcher in that area. I know that there's a fair amount of concern all over about any of the neurological disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, any of those, and the antitoxins that are given off in some of these events. Okay. It's a well-known fact. As a matter of fact, Harvard and some of the big Ivy League schools have been tackling those research questions for a while. And there is some pretty good papers out there about that. In terms of our area, anytime I think, I've sort of learned this from my researcher friends as well. I think anytime that you want to do a study about an area, I'm glad actually that last year was not a good year for the algal blooms, because we got a lot of background data, before any blooms happen, more or less. This is important data to have as a baseline. So what we don't have in this area, I think, is a really good handle on what our baseline looks like. Okay, that would be my guess, and that would be my first question. If as I was going to set up any kind of research project, I want to know what's the past got for information and what do we have for knowledge, and how is that changing as we go forward, or is it changing? And there's all sorts of statistical programs that you can run to correlate whether or not there's a direct relationship between the algal blooms that we're seeing now in the since 2015 and any higher rate of these neurological disorders in this area. I do know that Albemarle Regional Health is interested in this. I do know that we've been talking to them about that. We are the eyes on the water in the Chowan area. Maybe not so much for the Pasquotank. I think Green Saves Green does a really good job with that. They let us know, but we're in constant contact with these folks all the time. I mean, we get really busy on our Facebook page in the summertime. It gets really quiet in the wintertime, but come summer, everybody's sending us messages all over. They want to know where the blooms are, how bad are they, that kind of stuff. And I think that's important that we keep those networks open. But to answer your question more directly, we don't have any good research here that I know of. Okay. But I think it might be time for that. Okay. And I know that you've been doing some, I think, in this area. I think you have some information about that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have somewhere we have a higher incidence of ALS in this area, and we might
Right
go across the state or other places.
Right. I think there are hot spots there, without question. The Albemarle area may not be the only area in this state that is a hot spot. I think that's another question that you might want to ask is this showing up some places in inland where they have some of these blooms regularly on the inland lakes? Do they also have higher rates of these neurological diseases? That I don't know, but I think that's a question that needs to be investigated and maybe fleshed out a little bit more. And that's where your health professionals can come in, especially with records. You and I can't access health records too easily. And so you really need to have a very good body of, knowledge that's canvassing and recording health data, if we could, get a handle on that. And that's where our big hospitals and stuff may come in, like Centera, Biden in this area. I would think that they'd want to keep up with some of these things and at least record it in some way. It's very hard, and I'm just going to use this as an example. It's very hard even saying if a dog goes in the water and drinks the water, gets sick and dies. It's very hard putting that right back to the algal bloom and saying it's because they drank that water. Okay, I mean, you see newspaper articles about this all the time, and the cause and effect are not always that direct. You got to have a vet looking at it. You got to have also, water samples. You got to have all that stuff in place. And so, just saying, well, I think that's what did it. It might be, they might be right, but whether you have the exact proof of that or not, every time I read one of these science articles, I scratch my head and more. I say, how much more information do we need here? It really is a ball game as to how we put that data together and how much more proof we need. Okay, so I think we got the road ahead of us, and I think the road is open, and I would encourage you to continue on that road, because I think we need to, keep eyes on the water and keep people aware of that. If nothing else, make them understand that these are potential toxins and they could do a lot of damage over time. And we don't know the specifics about that, but in time we will. So I hope that answered your question as best as possible. Yeah. Yes, sir. Hi.
I'm Colleen Karl,
Hi.
and I'm with the Jim Catfish on ALS Foundation.
Right.
Give me on my next door neighbor. And I have tried every case of ALS that I'm possibly find in Eastern North Carolina since he passed.
Could you hold your mic a little bit closer? Thanks.
I've tried every case of ALS that I could find.
Right.
In the Albemarle region since Jimmy passed away at one time. I find 55 cases. And at one time, we had between 15 and 20 people living in the Albemarle area, living with ALS. And the normal incidence is 2 to 4 for 100,000 people. And there were only 100,000 people in this whole area. And I have been in touch with a urologist at Dartmouth, an epidemiologist at Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Right.
A urologist at the University of Miami, and the urologist at Dartmouth sent information and test kits to people attending our support group. That they sent back to him doing research because they thought there were ties to the blue-green algae and cyanobacteria, ALS.
Right.
And they're ongoing. They have hot spots up there. Down in South Florida, they have also have hot spots.
Sure.
And the research is going on now. In November, I pulled together 3 neurologists meeting on Sunday afternoon. Dr. Rich Bedline, Duke, probably the top ALS neurologist in the country, and with Ashley Stewart at Albemarle Regional Health. We're there trying to set up a research program to get funding to see if we can find out if there are ties actually to ALS, cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae. And Dr. Bedline said that when the ALS patients carried out, goes again to our support group, carry him the information that I had gathered, and he was just shocked at the number of ALS patients that we had living in this area, and we had lost
Right.
with the small population.
Yeah. And Tommy, I know we've met before at various different things, and I applaud your work, because you're right. You need a lot of legs on the ground to make this happen. Okay. A lot of folks that are interested. We're also working with Ashley over at the Albemarle Regional Health. This is why, and I try to get back to maybe some of our sensors here. We need more eyes on the water. Okay. At all times, we need more devices like this, which are very inexpensive and easy to use. We need more citizens and community scientists like you and everybody that's in here to keep an eye on what's going on in our backyard. Because you're right, this might be a hot spot. It probably is, okay, without question. And it may have been a hot spot for the last 50 years. Okay. I mean, what we don't have is that background data to be able to tell that. But that is coming. And so like always, you kind of like hindsight is really good. You wish you had done this 50 years ago, but we didn't know that this was going to be an issue again. And we maybe dismissed some of those key markers, especially with the health problems that were popping up in this area, because people maybe didn't communicate that well about those things. So we've got a big ladder to climb here, without question, to not only learn more about what's causing the algal blooms, how they're affecting our health, and maybe the outcomes of that in general. I think there's another question back there too.
We got a couple of questions.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
How inexpensive is inexpensive?
Oh, okay. So these just went up in price like everything else, like my bread in the supermarket, but only by a little bit. I think the last time I looked, they were $260 some odd. Okay. And that comes with a cord. I think they're now charging for the SD card, which is kind of, you can buy your SD card at Walmart for the same. They do have an SD card in them. And it's a teeny little tiny little micro one, but basically that's so that if for some reason they continuously record, but if for some reason it's not being shunted to the network at Purple Air, which happens because our local networks, our local infrastructure might go down, then the SD card is constantly recording that. So push comes to shove next year, if we have some areas that have been little gray spots on the map and they didn't, put their data up to Purple Air for whatever reason, we'll pull the SD cards and scour them for missing data that we have. So not a bad price. For under 300, probably you can put one of these in your house. And as I said, we're looking at getting about maybe 8 to 10 more, depending on how expensive they got, but probably someplace in that vicinity with the money that we got for this grant. And those will be distributed around this area as well. So yeah, so if you're interested, send me an email and we can talk a little bit. As I said, we're trying to put them in very areas to cover regionally, not only those transect spots that we have deliberately set up, but also broad area, because the winds come from the southeast in the summertime here. So all that stuff that we're getting, if it picks up something coming off the Albemarle Sound and puts it up to Arrowhead Beach in the Chowan River, that's coming from the southeast. So there's a huge amount of water in between there. So particles could be in the air for a long time. So we could have blooms in the Albemarle Sound that actually in the airspace are coming from that area. And that we don't know. We're going to have to really get a little bit more specific about what's happening out in the Albemarle Sound, especially since we got sensors that are out at the Outer Banks down in Columbia and other places like that. There are a couple of questions online. Okay.
Yes, we have Lisa from Duke Civil and Environmental Engineering, who's also working with Ashley at Albemarle Regional Health Services.
Okay.
She's commented that they received their first grant. And they look at ALS deaths in North Carolina over 20 years, and the prevalence is higher in this region compared to other regions. Western North Carolina is also a region of concern. Her question would be, is it realistic to collect water samples at the site of the Purple Air sensors?
I think that's something that we will be doing. That's what we have done in the past. And while that's a lot of legwork, we have a YSI unit that we use. And I know for a fact this summer, we're going to be working with Haley and another researcher this summer, putting that water quality together with the air quality. It's a necessity. Okay. So all of this fine work on these published research projects that have made it to journals, all of them have a water quality component. You really have to know what's going on the water to be able to tie that to the air without question. Okay, so yeah, water quality, what kind of bacteria or cyanobacteria are there? We'll send samples down to UNC. Not only do they do the nutrient analysis, they'll do a full workup on us, like going to the doctor and getting everything done. But, they'll also take a look at what they can see physically in the microscope. And some of it, because there's some DNA researchers in here at NC State that are tied into this, some of those might get sent off to those labs as well. So we'll be able to identify what kind of, and I'm going to use the word conjugars here. I had to learn this word just not too long ago, but basically it's the different shapes that these organic molecules, these bacteria tape. And because they're chains of amino acids, they can actually link on in different ways. And so they have a whole lot of different varieties. So they're called conjugars, for a fancy word for that. But basically, we'd be looking at specific conjugars of what kind of bacteria that's out there to know. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Colleen,
Yeah.
is that person interested in getting a sample?
What's that?
Is that person interested in obtaining a sample? Do they want us to send them one?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. You can ask that. I think she's with Albemarle Regional Health, right?
I think this Lisa was with.
Can you hear me?
Oh, is that Lisa from Duke?
Yes, hey,
Hey, how are you, Lisa?
I'm great. I just wanted to say quickly that thank you, Tommy, for all the work you do. And we did, as I said, we did look at deaths, ALS deaths over 20 years, and there's a definite very high prevalence in the Albemarle Sound region. And it would be great to have cases, which you're helping us with. But this summer, we do have our first grant and we're ready to purchase some of the air sensors and do some water sampling. So any help from anyone would be wonderful to help us identify some problem areas and then help us collect the water.
Okay, so Lisa, you and I need to chat on the phone, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
Because we are when we see the blooms at the Albemarle area, especially up on the Chowan River, and I know that some in Pasquotank too, we have equipment here that can get some good quality water samples and certainly can send them out to a lab for nutrient analysis and for other things as well. So let's do that. I think that's important to get that correlated data with the air quality.
Thank you so much.
Joseph, a question from Tiffany. She says, does the purple air sensor monitor criteria pollutants?
Say that again?
Does the purple air sensor monitor criteria pollutants?
No, unfortunately, I wish. So no, these are relatively inexpensive, $200, $300 sensors. In order to discern between if there's toxins in that particle or if there's other things like smoke or, anything like that in there, these do not do that. They're just going to give you overall particles, period. And so there are big disadvantages to that because then you're kind of guessing at times, but the advantages I think outweigh those disadvantages. And to be honest with you, putting EPA huge sensors like you maybe saw in some of the pictures on the PowerPoint, that's pretty impractical for most folks. I mean, those are huge devices, you got to lug them around. They're heavy. We moved them a couple of times. We took them down for a hurricane. We had to put them back up, so they're really not that easy to use. They might give you with, and then you got to have somebody scraping the plates and sending those in under sterile conditions to analyze what those particles are. So, that's a much more detailed process, but these are, good first shot at something that's happening in my backyard and not a bad way to, sort of raise the flag. If you're saying, oh, I think that we got a lot of algal blooms from the creek that's behind my house, but I have no proof of that. Well, you might be able to get one of these, $300 sensors and actually see that there are things coming off the water, just provided your neighbor's not cooking hot dogs at the same time. Okay.
And then Tim asks, have these purple air sensors been validated by the EPA or other government agencies to use this data for regulatory applications? Yeah, that's a good question. Yes and no. Okay, EPA is really looking into these very seriously. We, as I said, put up a separate device to compare with a known standard, something that was much more analytically correct than the purple air sensors, so that we have some sort of a control on this particular project that we're doing. But they are, I think because of the nature of that, they are, not bad, but they're not maybe as fine-tuned as you might want it for a research project. That's a very good question. Yeah. And then just a comment from Tiffany that they would be interested in participating at COA, so she sent her contact info. Great. Get in touch with us through us or through Green Saves Green, because we talk to those folks all the time, and we will definitely talk. Okay, as I said, we're looking for we're looking actually for extended grant projects, but we're also looking for corporate sponsorship as well. And so here's where I think some of our health agencies, and I have talked with several of them already, could come in very important, especially if you're looking to populate neighborhoods where there might be a high incidence of like respiratory ailments. So, they could come in as peripherals with the idea of monitoring respiratory health, but also be beneficial to studying, algal bloom movement or particle movement as well. So there's advantages to all of that. So I think there's potential in that as well. Okay. All right.
Are you monitoring performance improvement?
Say it again, please.
Are you monitoring the performance improvement?
Am I monitoring the Perquimans River? The CEG is not monitoring in terms of water quality, the Perquimans River. We will have a couple air sensors that are going in up in your area. You live up by Ashley, right? Up in that part of the world? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple of contacts that initially came that I haven't gone up to her. We put one in, I'll be honest with you about this. We put one in, an old student of mine actually volunteered to put one in, and he lived down on New Hope Road. And so we took a sensor down there, we installed it down there. I mean, they need satellite internet down there. Okay. we weren't getting a signal at all. And so that sensor had to come down. So I'm actually looking for placement for that one. I mean, one of the critical things about that, okay, that would be fine, because as I said, we would like to we've got a couple up in the Perquimans near the Belvedere area that need to go in. that yet, and I've got a couple over that have to go in more to the west of here, Northampton. There's one that's positioned, but it hasn't been installed yet in Hertford County. And there's a couple that are going to go in on the west side of the Chowan River. Because again, the prevailing winds, tell us that the direction comes across in that direction. So the wind blows it that way. So we want to see what's happening on the other side. And Coleraine area is notorious for getting blooms in the summer. They've had a lot of bad ones there over the years. So that's certainly a place that we'll be putting a couple of sensors as well. Any other questions? Okay. Well, let me just really finish up because I guess we're getting close to time here. I wanted to just say just a quick word because Green Saves Green is also involved in this aerosol project, or this, let me skip up here, this nutrient project that we've got going on. This is a grant that has come through the Department of Justice, and it's an environmental enhancement grant that Albemarle RC&D was involved heavily in, and they've engaged Green Saves Green, and they've engaged the Waterways Watch Group in Perquimans County to be the citizen scientists or the community scientists on the ground that are doing the collection work, because all of this is detailed analysis. So currently the CEG is involved. We're handling Potocacy Creek. So that's about a 4-hour run for us when we do that. And we actually run across there and pick up samples and send those down to UNC for analysis for nutrients. So what we're going to find out, or what we'd like to find out over the course of 2.5 years here, because these are samples coming in from the Pasquotank, from the Perquimans, and also from Potocacy, which feeds directly into the Chowan. We're going to find out a little bit more about when the nutrients are high, what nutrients are high at what time, what other parameters might be in there, like pH values, salinity, things like that. And then the really kind of neat piece on this one is this very cool technique that's being done by a professor at NC State, Dr. Chris Osborne, that is a fluorescence technique. So he will be able to take these samples and say, okay, we're going to look at this now, and then we'll be able to tell what the origin of these nutrients is. Is it runoff from the swamps, which a lot of it is? Is it maybe leaky septic systems, which could happen in our area, a lot of rural septic systems up there? Is it, other sources of nitrogen, and that might include animal feed operations and things like that? We simply don't know. Or in town, you might even see urban runoff where stuff is coming from over excessive fertilizer on, people's lawns in the town and stuff like that. That happens too. So I think at this point, we're going to get a signature off of this data. It will tell a little bit of a story. And so far, we're really seeing some changes seasonally. That's why I think the 2-year, actually 2.5, 3-year project is a good idea, because 1 year doesn't really tell a story, because you could have weird stuff going on in 1 year. So we're going to be looking at this over the course of 2.5, 3 years. And, Chris is going to be doing this analysis of the fluorescence to give us a picture of what's happening month by month. And I mean, month by month. We're out there in the wintertime too. So it's got cold this year on several dates, but that we're pulling samples to take a look at what the sources of these nutrients might be. And that is ever so more important, because you're not going to start any kind of mitigation plan if you don't know where it's coming from. And so that is our first step, is to be able to, we already know it's there. Well, we need to be able to now take some steps to say alleviate some of this problem if we can. There are some things that are out of our control, but there are some things that we might be able to, encourage more legislation, or certainly, talk to some of the landowners in the area, or some of the, the farming community. It's not just one source. I mean, I would say years ago, it was very easy when the Chowan River had a lot of pollutants, a lot of excessive nutrients. It was one bad boy, one, they could finger point who it was, and a couple others that were kind of accessories to the crime. But it wasn't like it is now, where it's coming in from all different sources. And so it really scratches the head to be able to figure out where these sources are and how we can better define that. So that's our mission right now, is to sort of work on this project concurrently, also with the Purple Air project. But I think this one is really of key importance to us, keeping our environment as good as it can be here. I don't know about you all, but we got connected to the bass fishermen last fall when we did a big thing in Edenton, and they were a blast. But they're a source of knowledge that I never knew. I mean, not only can they tell you what the water looks like on any given day, but they can tell you what kind of fish they're catching and how big they were. So the more partners you have on projects like this, and I'll just kind of close with that, the better off you are. because everybody knows something. Everybody has a piece of the puzzle, like Mr. Harrell volunteered some information today that I knew something about, but I need to learn more about that as well. So, you know, we open the door and we welcome more partnerships, and I think we will have more researchers. We already have a project that's underway for this summer that will be looking at toxins in fish tissue. Okay, so that's going to be another piece of this puzzle that we sort of get at least start to get a handle on it. And so, you know, we're all about building these partnerships and going forward. So these are the references, and those can go out. You can send those, or we can make sure that you get those if you wanted to look at those. First one is open source. You can just click on the link and go there. The other one, you'll have to have journal access, or you can pay for it as well if you want to read that one. Both of them are worthy of reading, especially when they're dealing with air particles and what the challenges with measuring those are. And then please contact us. We do a lot of Facebook. As a matter of fact, that's probably better than the website because it's interactive and it's current. And so I try to stay on there a lot in the summertime, and folks are always, you know, emailing us questions. They're always letting us know it's bad up at Dillard's Beach, or it's bad here, or, you know, you need to come take a look at this. Not that we're going to do DEQ's job for them, because that's their job, but we can at least make a phone call if we need to. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the reporting system, DEQ put in place about 1.5 years, 2 years ago now, a pretty good reporting system. Just Google fish kills or algal blooms in the Chowan River. That's all you need to do. And it's an online GIS map that will pop up, and you can report a bloom or report a fish kill, and they will respond to that. Okay, so, you know, do that. If you see something brewing in your backyard, or someplace that you just drove over a bridge and it looks mighty green, you know, make sure that it's not duckweed first, and then go ahead and report that to DEQ, and they will send someone out as best as they can to get a sample and do the analysis on that. So I would encourage all of you to do that. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here today, and hopefully we can get a few more of these out. And you guys, some of you are already citizen scientists or community scientists, but maybe we'll garner a little bit more support in that as well.
Well, thank you for coming
Yep.
out today. We greatly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.